So I'm going to talk really briefly about user objects, which is an incredibly helpful way to put clusters up into your Grasshopper menu bar. You can also take these user objects and share them. Grasshopper calls them user objects, although the terminology isn't used that often. And I'm going to show you through this example of a twisty tower that I created. I'm not going to go into the detail of how this works, because that's not the point. But the whole thing is that, it's a little twisty tower I created that creates these little Christmas tree-like formations. And let's say that I want to save this component, or this cluster rather. I'm going to double click inside. There's some operation inside. I'm not really interested in what happens inside, in so much as I want to save it. Now, one thing that you should know about details in clusters is that these cluster inputs, if you right click on them, if you double click on them rather, they have its name and nickname and description. And all of these show as being inherited from target. However, and right now they appear as geometry. However, as if I save and close, you notice that out here, this is what that earlier input corresponds to. It's actually called point. That's because out here in this world I came and renamed it point. I can rename it whatever I want, of course, but if I double click and go inside, the name of this doesn't actually change. Now, this is important for a few reasons, but I'll show why this is important. The way to create a user object is actually go to File and Create User Object here. And what this will do is I'll bring up this dialog, and you can give it a name. So let's call it the Twisty Tower. And give it a nickname. This is actually what's shown when you don't have the show full names displayed, but I really like to keep these the same. And a description, if you want to describe it. You can have different categories, so you can put it actually where you want, but I really like putting in user, that way you can keep track of all your user objects. Subcategories, so if you can make your own, you can say tower types, and you'll create a little box up here that instead of default and preview tower types will be created, but I'll just keep them default. I can even change the icon. I believe if I can change icon color, and if I click on this button, it takes a second, but I can even look at the universe of different or existing icons that exist out there for no reason whatsoever. Let's say that I'm going to use this image because it kind of looks like a twisting tower, or this image, say. Doesn't look like I can change the color, but that's what I'm going to do. And once I do that, it pops up here. I'm actually not sure why it pops up in preview instead of default. And this is a good way to show. If you right click on the component, you can delete it. Yes, delete it. I'm going to do that again. Create user object, twisty tower. I'm going to change the icon to that other icon. Takes a minute to load the icon library. And then I want the subcategory to be default. So you notice here, Twisted Tower has been created, and I can drag down and create it as I do any other component. Now, one thing you might notice is that this Twisted Tower has all these names here, but this Twisted Tower, the names of the inputs are all different. And that's actually really important because here the names of the inputs are self-explanatory. The point of tower means the point of tower, the segments, twist angle. But here you might not understand what cluster input means. And documenting how your cluster works is a really important thing to do. In fact, documentation in programming is very important to do so that other people or a future version of you looking back understands how this works. It's actually very important. Now, the reason why this is these names are different is again because this name was edited outside in this area, and actually if you double click on this cluster, the names that the cluster take are the names of these input objects. So what we're going to do is instead going to delete this component. So what I actually have to do is I'm actually going to go here And you notice that I double-clicked and renamed these on an earlier version of this video. But actually what we have to do, and this is a bug in Grasshopper and maybe fixed, hopefully, is that we have to create an input, rename it, called point of tower, and then connect it to anything. It turns out that if you create an input, connect it to something, and rename it, that rename will not take hold. Why that is a good idea, I do not know. It's a bug. But I'm going to do this with all the other inputs. Twist angle, and again I created the input, renamed it, and then connected to something. I'm going to do that with the output as well. And you know, if you think this is tedious, it is a part of documentation, but it's a really important part. Again, I can't reiterate how important it is and how tricky it will become when a future version of you forgets what this component was. So now I'm going to grab this. I'm going to make another user object, change the icon, call it Twisty Tower. And now when I do that, you can see that I've created them a new one and all the names are the same. And now this thing I can also double click it and go into an edit, but I can also kind of reference from this menu. The other thing is that cluster objects are .gh cluster files, so I could also right click on this and say export, and I could save this as a GH cluster file. Now I've already done this before, but I'll do it again. That means that later I can take this GH cluster file, drag it into Grasshopper, and I'll create this cluster file. Or I can also go into File, Special Folders, and go to User Object folder. That will open the folder that contains all these user objects. So you can see I already have this Twisty Tower folder. And now I can share this with someone else. I can put it in Dropbox folder and share it with someone else. And they, if our Dropbox folders were synced, and if upon reloading Grasshopper, they would see this menu, and they can drag then from their menu the component that you've created. So this is as close to as creating a plugin or a custom component as we'll get, without actually doing kind of the C# or the VB script, rather the C# work or encoding a custom component in C#. Suffice it to say that once you've created a really solid tool or really solid subcomponent, it's very, very helpful to start amassing your own little collection. You can see these are some older versions, but there are some components that I've done. You know, smallest angle between two lines. I'm getting something to calculate the standard deviation. Removing duplicate geometry, etc., etc., etc. So as you start to grow and your Grasshopper knowledge starts to increase, it's going to be very helpful to start to amass this collection of mini tools or mini components, and to share them with other people through either by going again to the special folder, the user object folder, and looking at all the GH cluster files and sharing them with colleagues or friends, or right-clicking here and clicking on export, or or by creating a user object and then having it be included up here in your menu bar. And then of course you can now start to search for it. So that's the tutorial about user objects, which I highly recommended you start using and start exchanging. Great.